Clara was unpacking some new crockery for the store when she happened to glance up and see Maggie Tilton crossing the street. Maggie, too anxious to stop herself, was coming to inquire about Woodrow Call. Every few days Maggie came on the same errand, thinking Clara might have some news of the Rangers. Clara didn't, but she could well understand Maggie's anxiety. She herself grew worried when several weeks passed without news of Gus McCrae. Except for the anxiety, though, their positions in regard to the men in question were opposite. Maggie's one hope was that Woodrow Call would someday unbend enough to marry her, while Clara was doing everything she could to check her foolish passion for Gus McCrae. Clara was doing her best not to marry Gus, while Maggie pinned all her hopes on finally marrying Woodrow. Maggie and Clara talked little. Their respective stations didn't permit it. What little conversation they had was usually just about the small purchases Maggie made, yet they had become, if not friends, at least women who were sympathetic to one another because of their common problem: what to do about the menfolk. The dishes and cups Clara was unwrapping and setting on the counter were nice, serviceable brown stoneware from Pennsylvania. Only the day before she had had a bit of a tiff with her father over the stoneware. Usually George Forsythe let Clara have her way when it came to ordering dishware, but in this case he happened to look at the bill and had what for him was a fit. He took off his coat, put it back on, told Clara she was bankrupting him with her impulsive ordering, and walked out of the store not to return for 3 hours. Clara was more amused than offended by her father's little fit. George Forsythe considered that he and he alone knew what was best for the solid frontier citizens who frequented their store. Whenever Clara ordered something that appealed to her, even if it was as simple as a pewter pitcher, her father invariably concluded that it was too fancy. Soon the store would fill up with things Clara liked that the customers either didn't want or couldn't afford, and ruin would follow. "I've had a store on this street since it started being a street," he informed his daughter. Sometimes, when he was particularly exercised, he even wagged his finger at her. "And I know one thing. The people of Austin won't shell out for your fancy Eastern goods." "Now that's not true, Pa," Clara protested. "Mrs. Skull shells out for them. Besides, nearly all our goods are Eastern goods. That's about the only place they make goods, seems like." "As for that woman, I consider her little better than a harlot," her father said. Most of the citizens of Austin looked up to George Forsythe. They had voted him mayor twice. But Inez Skull looked down on him, as she would on any tradesman, and she was quick to let him know it. "Just hold off on the Philadelphia plates," her father told her at the height of his fit, just before he walked out. "Plain plates and plain cutlery will serve around here just fine." The point of the brown stoneware, as Clara meant to tell him once he cooled down, was that it was plain, and yet it was satisfying to look at and solid besides. Clara loved the look and feel of it. She believed her father to be wrong in this instance. After all, she'd been working with him in the store for a decade. She felt she ought to have a right to order a little nice crockery now and then if she took the notion. If Inez Skull happened to like it, she would buy all of it anyway. Inez Skull always bought all of anything she liked, whether it was a swatch of pretty cloth or 2 new side saddles that happened to appeal to her. George Forsythe, seeing her shaky old butler loaded down with 2 new side saddles, could not resist asking why she needed 2. "Why, one for Sunday, of course," Inez said with a flounce. "I can't be seen in the same old saddle 7 days a week." "But those 2 are just alike," George pointed out. "Nonetheless, one is for Sunday. I doubt you'd understand, sir," Inez said as she swept out of the store. Clara loved the look and feel of the new stoneware and felt sure her father was wrong in assuming that it wouldn't appeal to local tastes. After all, Austin was no longer just a frontier outpost as it had been when her father and mother opened the store. There were respectable women in Austin now, even educated women, and they weren't all as high-handed as Inez Skull. Clara herself didn't care for either Skull. The famous captain had twice taken advantage of her father's absence to attempt to be familiar with her, once even trying to look down her bodice on a hot day when she had worn a loose dress. On that occasion, Clara slapped him smartly. She considered that she had tolerated quite enough, famous man or not. But the captain had merely bowed to her and bought himself a speckled cravat. But, like it or not, the Skulls were too wealthy to throw out entirely. Had it not been for their profligate spending, her father might, at times when drought dried up the farms and sapped the resources of the local livestock men, have had to worry seriously about the bankruptcy he accused Clara of bringing upon him. His fits, though, Clara knew, weren't really about the store, or the ordering, or the Eastern crockery. They were about the fact that she was unmarried and getting no younger. Suitor after suitor had failed to measure up. Her 20s were flying past, and yet there she was, still on her father's hands. She ought, in his view, to have long since become a well-established wife with a hard-working husband to support her. Many hard-working men, solid citizens, well able to support a wife, had sat in the Forsythe parlor and made their proposals. All were refused. Some licked their wounds for a few years and came back with new proposals, only to have those rejected too. After 2 tries and 2 failures, most of the local men gave up and took wives who were less exacting. Only Augustus McCrae and a man named Bob Allen, a rancher who wished to venture up to Nebraska and trade in horses, persisted year after year. In his own mind, and everyone else's, Gus McCrae, the proud Texas Ranger, seemed to have the inside track. Yet in Clara's mind, though she dearly loved Gus McCrae, the issues were not so clear nor the resolutions so simple. Still, her father could not be blamed too much for worrying that she might never find, or at least might never accept, a decent mate. Her mother, so sickly that she rarely ventured downstairs, worried too, but said little. The thing they all knew was that there was hardly another respectable young woman in Austin who, at Clara's age, was still unmarried. In fact, one of the few women Clara's age who was still single was Maggie Tilton, the young woman who was walking slowly and a little forlornly across the dusty street toward the store. Maggie, though, could not be included in the Forsythe reckoning because she was not one of the respectable young women of Austin. Inez Skull might behave like a harlot while enjoying the prestige and position of being the captain's wife, but Maggie Tilton was a harlot. She had survived some rough years in the tents and shacks of Austin, moved to San Antonio for a bit, and then came back to Austin. She had tried to rise, but failed, and had come back to be where Woodrow Call was, or at least where he was quartered when the Rangers were not in the field. Clara watched with interest as Maggie came up the steps and hesitated a moment as she looked at herself in the glass window. It was as if she had to reassure herself that she looked respectable enough to enter a regular store. Maggie always stopped and looked at herself before she would venture in to buy a ribbon or a powder for headaches or any little article of adornment. In Clara's view, Maggie looked plenty respectable. Her clothes were simple but clean, and she was always neat to a fault, as well as being modestly dressed. Madame Skull, for one, could scarcely be bothered to conceal her ample bosom. Even Clara's own father, George Forsythe, the former mayor, had trouble keeping his eyes off Inez Skull's bosom when it was rolling like the tide practically under his nose. Maggie, though, was always proper to a fault. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. And yet she did what she did with men with only the sadness in her eyes to tell of it, though that sadness told of it eloquently, at least to Clara. Sometimes Clara wished she could talk to Maggie. She longed to shake her good and tell her to forget about that hard-headed Woodrow Call. In her view, Maggie ought to marry some decent farmer, many of whom would have been only too pleased to have her, despite her past. Sometimes, lying alone at night in her room above the hardware store, a room that had been hers since birth, to which so far she had been reluctant to admit any man, though Gus McCrae had impulsively crowded into it once or twice, Clara thought of Maggie Tilton in her poor room down the hill. She tried once or twice in her restlessness to imagine that she and Maggie had traded places, that she was what Maggie was, a whore available to any man who paid the money. But Clara would never make the imagining work, not quite. She could picture herself down the hill in a shack or a tent, but when it came to the business with men, she was not able to picture it, not really. Though fervent in her kissing with Gus McCrae, fervent and even bold riding alone with him into the country to swim at a particular spring, she still stopped short, well short, of what Maggie Tilton did regularly for money in order to survive. Clara stopped far shorter with Bob Allen, the large, silent horse trader. Despite 2 years of courtship, Mr. Allen had not yet touched her hand. Augustus, who considered Mr. Allen an ignorant fool, would never have put up with such restraints. Gus had to touch her and kiss her, to dance with her and swim with her, and was sulky and sometimes rude when she refused him more. "It's your fault I'm a drunkard and a whorer," Gus told her more than once. "If you'd just marry me, I'd be sober forever, and I'd stay home besides." Clara didn't believe the part about staying home. Gus McCrae was by nature much too restless for her taste. The rangering was just an excuse, she felt. If there were no Indians to chase and no bandits, Gus would still find reasons to roam. He was not a settled man, nor did she feel she could settle him. He would always be off with Woodrow Call beyond the settlements somewhere adventuring. Still, she felt a little guilty where Gus was concerned. She knew there was some justice in his complaint. Though she suffered when he was in the whore tents, somehow she could not resign herself or commit herself to begin the great business of married life with him. Though Gus moved her in ways no other man ever had, or she feared ever would, something in her still refused. Clara tried to look at life honestly, though, and when she thought closely about herself and Gus and Maggie and Call, she could not feel that her refusals gained her any honor or moral credit. Was she any better than Maggie Tilton, who at least gave an honest service for money paid and met an honest need? Clara didn't think she was better, and she knew she was as hard on Gus McCrae, whom she dearly loved, as Woodrow Call was on Maggie Tilton. Clara didn't like, indeed couldn't abide, Woodrow Call. His appearance, even on the mildest errand, brought out a streak of malice in her which she could not restrain. She seldom let him leave her company without cutting him with some small criticisms. Yet Woodrow Call was a much-respected ranger, courageous and even in judgment, the last being a quality that Augustus McCrae could not yet lay claim to, though he was as courageous as any man. Perhaps Call even loved Maggie in his way. He sometimes bought her small trinkets, once even a bonnet, and had twice come to fetch medicines for her when she was poorly. There must be good in the man, else why would Maggie pine so when he was away? She surely didn't pine for every man who paid her money and used her body. Still, the one thing Maggie needed most was marriage. It might be the one thing Gus McCrae needed most as well, but Call couldn't or wouldn't give it to Maggie, and she couldn't give it to Gus. It was a linkage that irked her, but that she could neither ignore or deny. When Maggie stepped in the door after giving herself a thorough inspection, Clara smiled at her, and Maggie, surprised as she always was by Clara's friendliness, shyly smiled back. "Why, it's you. How I wish we were sisters," Clara said, surprising herself and startling Maggie so deeply that she blushed. But the store was empty. What harm could the remark do? Besides, it was what she felt. It had always chaffed Clara that she was expected to live by rules she hadn't made. All the rules were made by men, and what dull rules they were. How much pleasanter life would be if she could treat Maggie as she would treat a sister, or at least as she would treat a friend. "Oh, Miss Forsythe, thank you," Maggie said. She knew she had received a great compliment, one so unexpected that it left her abashed and silenced. For years she was to remember Clara's impulsive statement and feel happiness at the memory. She also felt a little puzzlement. Clara Forsythe was the most respected and sought-after young woman in Austin. Many of her own customers, the young ones particularly, worshipped Clara. Several had even proposed to her. Maggie could not imagine why a woman in Clara's position would even want her friendship, much less want her for a sister. Clara realized she had embarrassed her customer and tried to put her at ease by directing her attention to the stoneware. "We just got these cups and plates from Pennsylvania," she said. "My pa thinks they're too fancy, but I think they're the very thing." Maggie agreed, but she only let her eyes linger on the nice brown crockery for a moment. She had to be cautious when shopping, so as not to start yearning for fine things she could never afford. She did like pretty things too much. Once her fancy seized on a particular ring or dress or trinket, she could scarcely think of anything else for days. She especially wanted to impress on Woodrow that she was a good manager. She didn't owe a cent to anyone, and had never asked Woodrow or any man for a cent more than she was due. She had long since stopped wanting Woodrow Call to pay her when he came to her, but he insisted, leaving the money under a plate or a pillow if she refused to take it. Maggie, just for a moment, wished she could be Clara Forsythe's friend. If they could talk freely, she felt sure Clara would understand why she no longer wanted Woodrow's money. Clara's smile was frank and friendly, but before Maggie could even enjoy her little fancy, an old man with a stringy beard came in and stomped right between them. "Horseshoe nails?" he asked Clara. "Yes, sir, in the back. It's the bin on the right," Clara said. With a customer in the store, Maggie didn't feel she ought to be talking to Miss Forsythe about crockery, much less about anything else. Besides, the man was a customer of hers as well. His name was Cully Barnstone. He had visited her frequently in the last year. His presence, as he sacked up horseshoe nails, drove home a point that Maggie knew she should not even momentarily have forgotten. She and Clara Forsythe weren't sisters and couldn't be friends. Clara had never been offered money for the service of love and never would be. She might have her own difficulties with Augustus McCrae, but she would never experience the shame of being given money by the one man in the world she wanted to give herself to. Clara was annoyed with old Cully Barnstone for coming in just when she might have had a word of conversation with Maggie, but there was nothing she could do about it. The store was open. Anyone who wanted to buy something was free to come in. When Mr. Barnstone came to the counter to pay for his nails, Maggie turned away. She wandered listlessly around for a bit, keeping well to herself. She picked up a bonnet and a little hat, but put both back without trying them on. In the end, she merely bought a packet of darning needles and some red thread. "Thank you," she said when Clara gave her change. "There's no news from those wild ranger boys," Clara said. "I suppose they're still up on the plains freezing their ears." "Yes, it's been sharp weather. I expect they're cold," Maggie said as she went out the door. When P.I. set out north with the Rangers on his first expedition, he was as proud as he had ever been in his life. Mr. Call, who found him in a cornfield, fed him, and persuaded Captain Skull to give him a tryout as a ranger, had emphasized to him that it was just a tryout. "We need men, and I think you'll do," Call told him rather sternly. "But you watch close and follow orders. I told the captain I'd vouch for you. Don't you disgrace me now and make me regret speaking up for you." "I won't, sir. I'll watch close," P.I. said, not entirely sure what he would have to be watching. "If you get scalped, don't sit around yowling either," Gus McCrae said. "People survive scalping's fine if they don't yowl." He said it to josh the boy a little, but P.I.'s big, solemn eyes opened a little wider. "What's the procedure, then?" he asked. Long Bill Coleman, an experienced man, had told him there were procedures for every eventuality in rangering. P.I. meant to do all he could to avoid a scalping, but in the event that one occurred, he wanted to know what steps he should take, or not take. "Just sit there calmly and bite a stick," Gus told him, doing his best to keep a straight face. "Somebody will come and sew up your head as soon as there's a lull in the killing." "Why'd you tell him that?" Call asked later when he and Augustus were cleaning their weapons. "Of course he'll yowl if he gets scalped." "No, he won't, because I instructed him not to," Augustus said. "But if I get scalped, you'll hear some fine yowling, I bet." On the trek north, P.I.'s job was to inspect the horses' feet every night to see that no horses had picked up thorns or small rocks that might cause lameness. In the event of a chase, a lame horse would put its rider in serious jeopardy. P.I. inspected every hoof at night and made sure that the horses were well secured. Then the sleet came, and he had a hard time looking close. In the worst of the storm, he could barely see his horse. At night, he had to deal with the horse's feet mostly by feel. His hands got so cold when he worked that he was afraid he might have missed something in one hoof or another, but none of the horses went lame. Dietz, the black man, seeing P.I. try to inspect the hooves in the dark, brought him a light and stayed with him while he went down the line of horses, picking up their hooves one by one. It was a kind thing, which P.I. never forgot. Most of the men stayed as close to the fire as they could get, but Dietz left the warmth and came to help him make sure that the horses' feet were sound. On the fourth day of cold, P.I. began to wish Mr. Call had just left him in the cornfield. Proud as he was to be a ranger, he didn't know if he could survive the cold. He got so cold at night and in the bitter mornings that he even forgot to be afraid of scalping Indians or even death. All he could think of was how nice it would be to be in a cabin with a big fireplace and a roaring fire. It was so cold his teeth ached. He began to try to sneak food into his mouth in small, quick bites so the cold wouldn't get in and freeze his teeth worse than they already were. Augustus McCrae, who seemed able to ignore the cold, noticed P sneaking in the tiny bites and decided a little more joshing wouldn't hurt. "You ought to duck your chin down into your shirt if you're going to try and eat in this breeze," he said. "If you ain't careful, your tongue will freeze and snap off like you'd snap a stick." "Snap off?" P.I. asked, horrified. "How could it snap off?" "Why, from talking," Gus said with a grin. "All you have to do is ask for a cup of coffee and your tongue's liable to fall right into the cup." Later, P.I. told Dietz what Mr. McCrae had said, and they debated the matter quietly. P was so cautious about opening his mouth that he could barely make himself heard. "Your tongue's inside your head," Dietz pointed out. "It's got protection. Ain't like your finger. Now, a finger might snap off, I expect, or a toe." P.I.'s fingers were so cold he almost wished they would snap off to relieve the pain, but they didn't snap off. He had been blowing on his fingers, blowing and blowing, hoping to get a little warmth into them when the Indians attacked and killed Ranger Watson. P.I. had been about to step right past the man in order to take cover behind some saddles when he heard Jimmy Watson give a small grunt, just a small quick grunt, and in that instant his life departed. If P.I. had not moved just when he did, making for the saddles, the bullet might have hit him. It passed just behind his leg and went only another yard or more before striking Jim Watson dead. No one in the troop was as glad to see the sunshine the morning they finally headed south as P.I. Parker. "The dern old sun, it's fine to come out again," he said to Long Bill Coleman. To P.I.'s surprise, he almost cried, so happy was he to see the familiar sun. He had always despised cloudy weather, but he had never despised it as much as he had during the recent days of cold. Fortunately, Long Bill Coleman took no interest in P.I.'s remark and didn't see him dash away a tear. Long Bill was attempting to shave using a bowl of water so cold that it had a fine skim of ice on it. He considered the whole trip an intolerable waste of time, in that it was no different from most expeditions against the Comanches, only in this instance colder. "Me, I'll take Mexico over these darn windy plains," he told Augustus McCrae when the troop was on the move south. "Me too, Billy. There's plenty of whores in Mexico, and pretty ones too," Gus remarked. "Now, Gus, I'm married. Don't be reminding me of the temptations of the flesh," Long Bill admonished. "I got enough flesh right there at home. There's no shortage of flesh on Pearl." Augustus thought the comment dull, if not foolish. "I know you've got a fat wife, Billy," he said. "What's your point about Mexico? I thought that was what we were talking about." "Why, the point is it's convenient," Long Bill said. "In Mexico, there's Mexicans." The remark seemed even duller to Augustus than the one before it. Since marriage to Pearl, Long Bill had lost much of his liveliness in Gus's opinion. He had grown dull, cautious, and even pious. His wife, Pearl, was a large woman of little attraction, a bully and a nag. Had he himself been married to Pearl, he would have endeavored to spend as much time as possible in the nearest bordello. "In Mexico, there's usually someone to ask where the bandits are," Long Bill went on, "and there's trees to hang them from once we corner 'em. Out here on the plains, there's no one to ask directions from, and if we do see an Indian, he's apt to be way down in the canyon where you'd have to scramble to get at him." Augustus didn't answer. The fact was he missed Clara. No amount of easily located bandits or hanging trees made up for that one fact. A good 2-week jaunt on the prairies always lifted his spirits. But then inevitably there'd come a night by the campfire or a groggy morning when he'd remember his old sweet love and wonder if he'd been foolish to let his long courtship lapse just for the sake of adventure. Despite her standoffish ways, Augustus felt most of the time that there was little likelihood that Clara would actually marry anyone but himself. At other times, though, the demon of doubt seized him, and he was not so sure. P.I. found Mr. McCrae puzzling. Mr. Call he was more comfortable with because Mr. Call only spoke to him of practical matters. Mr. McCrae sounded convincing when he talked, but a good deal of what he said was meant in jest, like the business about his tongue snapping off. The hardest part of P.I.'s job as the company farrier was to see that the captain's big horse, Hector, did not get anything wrong with his feet. P.I. had never seen an elephant, but he doubted that even an elephant had feet as heavy and hard to work with as Hector. The captain had to have special horseshoes forged to fit the big horse's feet. When P.I. did manage to lift one of Hector's hooves, the big horse would immediately let his weight sag onto P.I. He could just support the weight, but it left him no strength with which to clean out the hoof. Several times, Dietz, seeing his plight, had come over and helped him support the big horse long enough that his feet could be properly cleaned. "Much obliged," P.I. always said when Dietz helped him. "Welcome, sir," Dietz would reply. It unnerved P.I. to be addressed as sir, though he knew that was how black people normally addressed white people. He didn't know if it would be correct just to ask Dietz to call him by his name. He intended to discuss the point with Mr. Call when the time was right. Then, to his dismay, though they traveled south through a day of sunlight, the cold struck again. On the third day of their ride south, the sky turned slate black, and an icy wind was soon slicing at their backs and making their hands sting. That night, Hector leaned particularly heavily on P.I., and Dietz was too busy preparing a meal to help him. Pressing up against the big horse caused P.I. to break a sweat. When he finished, the sweat froze on his shirt before he could even walk back to the fire. The sun had just gone down. P.I. did not know how he was going to make it through the long winter night. He had only a thin coat and one blanket. Few of the men had more. Dietz didn't have a coat at all, just an old quilt he kept wrapped around himself as he worked. It was Dietz who showed P a way to survive as the cold deepened. Dietz took a little spade and dug out one side of a small hummock of dirt. He dug it so that it formed a sort of bank. Then he made a small fire up against the bank of dirt. He brought a few coals over in a small pan, and from the coals made a fire near enough to the bank that the bank caught the heat and reflected it back. "Here, sit close," Dietz said to P.I. "It ain't much, but it will warm us." He was right. P.I. could never get close enough to the big campfire to derive more than a few moments of warmth from it, but the little fire reflected off the bank of dirt warmed his hands and his feet. His back still froze, and his ears pained him badly, but he knew he would survive. Even with the good fire, it was difficult to sleep, though. He would nod for a few minutes, and then an icy curl of wind would slip under his collar and chill his very backbone. Once, in a few minutes of sleep, P.I. had a terrible dream. He saw himself freeze as he was walking. He stopped and became immobile on the white plain, like a tree of ice. P.I. tried to call out to the rangers, but his voice could not penetrate the sheath of ice. The rangers rode on, and he was alone. When he woke from the dream, there was a red line on the eastern horizon. The sun glowed for a moment and then passed above the slate-like clouds, which reddened for a little while, but did not allow the sunlight through. "Much obliged for keeping this fire going," P.I. said. All night Dietz had fed the fire little sticks. "You're welcome, sir," Dietz said. P.I., cold but glad to be alive, could not contain himself about the sir any longer. "You don't need to be sirring me, Dietz," he said. "I ain't a sir, and I doubt I ever will be one." Dietz was startled by the remark. He had never heard such an opinion from a white man, never once in his life. In Texas, a black man who didn't call a white man sir could get in trouble quick. Of course, P.I. wasn't really a grown man yet. He was just a tall boy. Dietz supposed his youth might account for the remark. "What'll I say?" he asked with a puzzled look. "I got to call you something." "Why, just P.I. will do," P.I. said. "I'm just plain P.I. so far." Dietz didn't think it would do, not in the hearing of the other rangers at least. He turned away and went to gather a few more sticks. The fire was burning well, but he needed a little time in which to think about what Mr. P had just said. Then, while he was pulling up a half-buried twist of sagebrush, it occurred to him that his mind had found a solution. He thought of the tall white boy as Mr. P. He would call him Mr. P. When he came back with the wood, the young ranger was still holding his hands to the little fire. "I guess I just call you Mr. P if it suits you," Dietz said. "Why, yes, that'll do fine," P.I. said. I guess I'm a mister. I guess everybody's a mister. No, I ain't. Black people ain't, Dietz thought. But he didn't say it.